President Bush goes to Tokyo tonight, tomorrow Japanese time. It presents a most appropriate time to rerun a series on Japanese-American relations that we first broadcast last spring. It's called Culture Clash, and over the next 4 nights, our business correspondent, Paul Salmon of public station WGBH in Boston, will examine the ups and downs of our complex relationship with the Japanese.
For 41 years, Cadillac has defended our shores as America's luxury sales leader. Now, from out of the land of the rising sun come the luxury cars of rising prices. But Cadillac fights back.
This TV ad played all over the South. Though they meant it in jest, the Cadillac dealers of the South were forced to pull the ad within 2 days after being criticized for reviving an American stereotype of the evil Japanese. On the other hand, Pearl Harbor is not our only stereotype. For years, there's been a competing image of Japan as a source of great and exotic wisdom and, more recently, of economic salvation. Arriving at a private airport just outside New York City, here comes one of Japan's most powerful men. And according to those who romanticize Japan, one of America's economic saviors, the chairman and co-founder of the Sony Corporation, Akio Morita. He was lionized on American TV as far back as 1972, when Morley Safer profiled him for 60 Minutes.
At a time when most of the American electronics industry has moved to Japan to have its products made there, but labeled here, Morita is bringing jobs back to this country.
19 years later, Sony has built 9 U.S. factories employing 8,500 American workers. Last year, Akio Morita was bound for Dothan, Alabama with his wife to celebrate another anniversary, Sony's 30th year of manufacturing in America. We went along for the ride, and to see the positive image of the Japanese these days. The Moritas weren't about to disappoint us. I understand. As we made our way south to Dothan in Sony's most luxurious corporate jet, Morita confided that he was troubled by Americans who, in the spirit of the Cadillac ad, are reviving our dark image of the Japanese.
We feel basically America is strong. Why America shows such a weakness and criticize us so emotionally?
Good Japan, bad Japan. Both stereotypes have been around for years and have remained remarkably similar over time, even though the U.S.-Japan relationship has flip-flopped dramatically. In this World War II propaganda film, directed by Hollywood's Frank Capra, you see the negative stereotype at perhaps its most vivid, the Japanese as fanatics.
As iron ore is melted in furnaces to remove impurities, so in Japan, humanitarian impurities are burned out of the child. As the steel is shaped by beating and hammering, so is the boy hammered and beaten into the shape of the fanatic samurai.
To Americans of the 1940s, the Japanese had other unsavory personality traits as well. Sneakiness, for example.
Judo, or jiu-jitsu, is the act of giving in, making your opponent lose his balance. Then trip him, choke him, hit, chop, poke, or kick his vital spots. Jap diplomats think in terms of judo. For example, make an offer of peace just before you intend to attack. When we went from black and white to color, the image turned lurid. Often it was yellow, as in Yellow Peril. Admiral Yamamoto was yellow for having launched a cowardly sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. Finally, we saw the Japanese as two-faced, the mimic with a menacing soul. Put it all together and you had a deep racial stereotype. If the Nazis were vile, the Japanese were subhuman, a rung down on the evolutionary ladder. But remember, the image of the bad Japan has alternated with a positive stereotype. And the same traits that we condemned during the war became associated with the good Japan as soon as the war was over. Here's Leatherneck, the magazine of the U.S. Marine Corps, first issue after the Japanese surrendered. Already, right here on the cover, the stereotype was undergoing a transformation, from menacing ape to cute, if somewhat irritable, monkey. By the early 80s, the same Japanese fighting techniques Frank Capra had denounced during the war were being extolled as martial arts.
Karate here. Karate here. Karate never here.
Mr. Miyagi of the Karate Kid movies was becoming an American role model. In print, the image of Japan was becoming positive as well. By the mid-'80s, Americans had become infatuated with the Japanese way of business and had made these and other books bestsellers. By now, Japan has come to be seen as economically invincible, and therefore threatening once again. And the same values we'd come to see so positively, self-sacrifice, hard work, learning from others, are being seen as negative once more. Some Americans even think we're back at war. Only this time, we're losing.
We're being bought. We're not being invested in. We're being bought. And along with buying goes control. The Japanese want to control this country. Let's just face it, it's cheaper to buy us than it is to bomb us.
June Collier is CEO of a large auto parts company in Montgomery, Alabama. She says she won't even take an order from a Japanese manufacturer.
They don't play fair. They are ruthless. They will break companies in this country.
You really believe that?
I don't believe it. I know it.
Collier may be extreme, but her views have received plenty of attention on CBS's 48 Hours, on CNN, and shows across the country. At her Alabama plant, many of Collier's employees are similarly hostile to the Japanese.
I am glad there are Japanese over here. I want them to come here. I want them to spend their money on seeing our wonderful tourist attractions. Then I want them to take their suitcases and their Nikons and go home.
Collier has taken these fears national, barnstorming the country in her private jet. Her latest worry is that Japan's stranglehold on the semiconductor industry, key to modern military technology, could be sold to a country other than America.
And they asked me on a show what I thought about that, and I said, well, you know, I guess I'd be forced to say, well, gentlemen, you're right, totally right. But we have a few semiconductors left. We may have to give them back to you from 60,000 feet.
Oh, 60,000 feet meaning,
Imagine a few years from now, it's December, and the whole family's going to see the big Christmas tree in Hirohito Center.
For the past few years, the road has been getting more dangerous. Advertisers like the Cadillac dealers or Pontiac here have already played heavily to a renewed surge of anti-Japanese feeling.
Go ahead, keep buying Japanese cars.
Bad Japan, good Japan. In the past, the images alternated, the bad Japan displacing the good and vice versa. Both images are clearly part of the American psyche. But these days, the two images seem to coexist in a sort of struggle for American hearts and minds.
Well, there's been a 20-point drop in positive attitudes toward the Japanese in the last 3 years.
Pollster Stanley Greenberg says Americans these days are more negative about the Japanese, as we've seen, but he says at the same time, we're more admiring.
Right now, Americans tend to associate most of the values that they think of as positive with the Japanese. Hardworking, good families, planning ahead, all of those things which Americans are supposed to have as part of their identity, Americans now seem to associate with the Japanese. So it plays itself out as almost a love-hate relationship. We see too much of ourselves in the Japanese to simply hate them. And that produces, I think, a lot of anxiety about how to deal with these relations.
In other words, as the final episode of the Bob Newhart show illustrated in prime time last year, Americans are confused and ambivalent about the Japanese as perhaps never before.
I'd like to buy your town and turn it into a golf course.
The new Japan poses an economic challenge more profound, some think, than the military challenge of World War II. Because Japan is now beating us at our own game on our own playing field. So, we're more ambivalent than ever.
Most of us were born here. Most of us will die here. No, Mr. Takadashi, this is one town you cannot buy.
That's right.
I'll give you $1 million for each home. Bring on the freaking bulldozers.
These days, it's not a bulldozer, but a stretch limo. We're finally ready to rejoin Sony's Akio Morita here in Dothan, where more than 1,000 Alabamans work for him. And as the Moritas arrive at the plant, the Americans here choose to shake, not bite, the hands that feed them.
Welcome to Dothan, Alabama, Mr. Morita. We are so proud to have you, Mrs. Morita.
The boss has come halfway around the world to visit the troops. No wonder they've rolled out the red carpet here in Dothan this morning. At close range, we're dressing up here for the traditional plant tour, the Moritas seem a lot more like kindly grandparents than invaders from the East.
You're not likely to accuse these people of taking over America if you're part of the family.
Taking care of me like my mother.
A model of efficiency. This Sony factory makes all the audio and videotapes it sells in America. More than 250,000 a day. Given the huge volume, the pace seems a little slow.
Many people say Japanese machine moves slow, but we feel steadiness is more important.
Slow but steady, committed fanatically to constant improvement. It's what we've come to admire about the Japanese. But as Sony celebrates its 30th birthday in America, it's also what some of us, once again, are beginning to fear. The anniversary gala is underway. The theme is mostly Mardi Gras, the revelers mostly Alabaman, the hosts almost all Japanese.
Please welcome back to Dothan, Mr. Kei Tozawa.
Chosen by lottery, the king and queen of the day shift arrive with a flourish. But, and here's the key point, there's no question who's the real royalty in this castle. Appearances notwithstanding, Sonyland is not exactly the Magic Kingdom. The queen of the day shift was laid off for 2 years in 1985, and both she and the king say working for the Japanese can be awfully tough.
Well, you would want to impress the Japanese to show them that the Americans can produce a superior quality product. And we can, and we do.
But that's sometimes tough to do to impress them?
Oh, yes, yes. They make it tough.
Because the Japanese want it their way. Everything here, from dance partners to entertainment to autographs from the boss, is meticulously managed. In a scrapbook provided by the company, the Morita's signatures roll smoothly off the line. Everyone is expected to conform and have their book signed. Then it's time for consensus and the company cheer. Morita's younger brother leads the troops in a banzai hurrah for the 90s. To us, though, the enduring image of the day is this one. The two faces of Akio Morita. In the flesh, a humble, diminutive figure barely visible behind the podium. On the screen, a giant Orwellian icon towering over the room.
Our company is for you. You are company. Sony is your company.
Sony, more Western than most Japanese firms, still challenges our most basic notions of how to succeed in business. There's little room for rugged individualism or even a spontaneous standing ovation.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would at this time, will you join me in a standing ovation for Mr. Morita, thanking him for our jobs and continued support.
I think the Japanese are forcing a fundamental challenge to some of the fundamental beliefs and paradigms of the United States.
Harvard professor Mike Yoshino, Japanese by birth but culturally an American, believes Japan poses a threat to our very way of life.
The Japanese believe in group efforts, consensus, and strong sense of discipline, and weism, and which is a really direct contrast to a rugged individualism and belief in individual and individual freedom.
It's a challenge to our basic self-definition.
Yes, indeed. The only challenge, then, to American ideology comes from Japan. And there, of course, the results speak for themselves. And that, I think, to an average American is a rather uncomfortable thought.
So we're back where we started, with the two images of Japan. In a sense, we're uncomfortable with both of them. The bad Japan threatens our independence. The good Japan threatens our sense of who we are. 1941 wasn't just the year of Pearl Harbor. It was also the year Henry Luce of Time and Life magazine announced the start of the so-called American century. Now, only 50 years later, people are saying that the American century is over, that economically the future belongs to Japan. And the worse we feel about our future, the more likely we are to blame the Japanese and revive the negative stereotypes of Pearl Harbor and the past.
Again, the main stories of this Monday. U.S. Matters. We turn next to part 2 of our series entitled Culture Clash. Last night, business correspondent Paul Salmon of public station WGBH looked at the way Americans view the Japanese. Tonight, he turns the table and examines the relationship from the Japanese viewpoint.
A Japanese TV ad mocking militaristic Japanese managers and their American workers, many of whom just can't keep up. The stereotype of the lazy American is becoming commonplace among the hard-driving Japanese. More and more Americans are simply down and out. The negative image of Americans is increasingly popular in Japan.
But Japanese still obsess about America. For the 3 years leading up to the 50th Pearl Harbor anniversary, the Japanese worried about how Americans would react. They may poke fun at us at times, but more than 3 million Japanese will have traveled halfway around the world this year to see how we live and to shop in America. Increasingly, Japanese may feel superior to Americans, yet they're as drawn as ever to American culture. In a word, they seem ambivalent, and this ambivalence towards us mirrors our ambivalence towards them. Where does their attitude come from? In large part, it would appear, from the often extreme differences between our two cultures, differences which, absent deep understanding, have often led to caricature.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 4 guys.
Nashville, Tennessee's Grand Ole Opry, a typical stop for Japanese tourists in America. Only these Japanese are not simply tourists. They're corporate executives here to size up the state of American society and report their impressions back home. During a break between acts, Tatsuo Ito on the right and Jiro Aiko are given a backstage tour. Immediately, they're confronted by conspicuous contrasts with culture back home. For example, public displays of affection are very rare in Japan. So is backstage informality.
I thought this place must be closed for general public, but it seems this is open. Everybody can come in.
Is this gentleman from Sony?
Yes, he is.
Yes. I want to thank you. You bought CBS.
Yes.
And 3 publications. I make the awards for CBS.
CBS Records is a major label in the country music business, which makes Jiro Aiko a sort of Nashville mogul.
4 of your